Welcome to Middle East Dialogues, a series of conversations with leading scholars and writers, produced by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Your host for this episode is Nader Hashemi, the director of the center and associate professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Our guest for this episode is Madawi Al-Rasheed. She is a leading expert on Saudi Arabia and currently a visiting professor with the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics and research fellow at Open Society Foundation. Previously, she was prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. Her publications include Muted Modernists, The Struggle Over Divine Politics in Saudi Arabia, A Most Masculine State, Gender, Politics, and Religion in Saudi Arabia, and A History of Saudi Arabia.
Well, Madawi, welcome to the University of Denver. It's a huge honor to have you with us for our Denver Dialogues.
Thank you very much for having me.
Congratulations also on the publication of Muted Modernists. I enjoyed the book tremendously. It really gives insight into a part of Saudi Arabia that most outsiders are unaware of. We know about the Saudi royal family, so the sort of court Salafi ulama, and then the rebellious jihadis, but you open our eyes to this sort of third force within Saudi society. Who are these muted modernists and why are they important?
Well, the idea of muted modernists came actually out of this sort of polarized scholarship that we have the Wahhabi establishment on one hand, and we overstudied it. Its origins from the 18th century to the 20th century. In addition to also the points of friction between the regime and the Wahhabi movement as it developed over the centuries. We're talking here about 250 years at least of history. So it is overstudied in terms of the doctrine and the relationship with politics. At the same time, after 9/11, Saudi Arabia was overstudied from a particular angle, and that is the jihadi current.
Right.
Obviously, because of the violence that it inflicted not only inside Saudi Arabia, but also in the US. And therefore, we have this scholarship. But there, in between those two extremes, there's a third way. And this third way attracted my attention. And I must confess, there is a personal story. Throughout 2009, 2010, Amnesty International reported on the trials of a group of Saudi activists. And one of the charges against them was that the government accused them of reading my articles and one of my books. So I looked deeper into this group and discovered that they are activists of not only Islamist character, but also people who hadn't been associated with an Islamist movement. And they came together in what I would call national politics beyond the Islamist liberal divide. So I was interested in finding out what their project is and give them a voice that had been denied because of this polarization in scholarship.
So can you give us some of the ideological and political content of their ideas? Yeah. How can we understand their ideological orientation, not just in relationship to other ideological currents in Saudi Arabia, but also within the broader Arab Islamic world?
Yeah. I use the word modernists in order to describe this current. It is not an organized current. It doesn't have a civil society, a political party, but it's a group of intellectuals and authors, writers, lawyers, who come together to rethink important norms and principles. And they have been in constant sort of interaction with the global discourse on human rights. So we can't really classify them as Islamist or liberal. They are a mutation, and I use the word mutation in the book in order to describe a current that tries to go back to the text of Islam, try to find the points of contact and commonalities between Islamic texts that deal with the rights of individual and also global human rights discourse. So you can't classify them, and they do not fit easily in one category. But I think their greatest achievement is that some of them had been brought up within the Salafi tradition. They had been in Saudi schools, such as Abdullah Al-Hamid, such as Judge Sulaiman Al-Rasheed. All of them are product of the Salafi tradition. But in addition to their education as religious scholars, they were engaged in a wider debate about human rights. In a way, they say in their writing that they've had enough of those preachers who tell a Muslim what the rights of their rulers are. So the rights of their rulers are overemphasized in Saudi Arabia, as the Wahhabi preachers go in the mosque on a Friday to deliver a sermon, and all they talk about is how a Muslim should obey the ruler. And they say that this is a distortion of Islam, because Islam is not simply about obeying your ruler, it's about you getting your rights from the ruler. So they interpret important concepts. Let's talk about jihad. Everybody talks about jihad today, and in the mind of many scholars and observers of the Muslim world, they think jihad is about armed struggle. So what Abdullah Al-Hamid does, he takes the concept and says, well, no, there is something called civil jihad. And civil jihad for him is to establish a civil society to protect yourself. It's a buffer zone between the society or the individuals in a society and the government. So for him, jihad is civil society, is mobilization in a peaceful way. Another concept that he considered is hisba, which is commanding right and prohibiting vice. In Saudi Arabia, this translates into the religious police. Any visitor to Saudi Arabia is intrigued by this force that is employed by the government, that roams the streets of the big cities. They tell people what to do. They ask them to go and shut their shops and pray during prayer time. So somebody like Abdullah Al-Hamid says this is a distorted practice in Saudi Arabia. Hisba, or commanding right and prohibiting vice, should become like civil society, and therefore it's a buffer zone that allows the individual to struggle for their rights within an Islamic framework. So Al-Hamid and his colleagues combine their understanding of Islam with global discourse on human rights.
In terms of classifying this group of political intellectuals, activists, scholars, in the introduction to the book, you sort of are very reluctant to classify them within the post-Islamist framing of Asif Bayat. And I was reading it very closely, and everything that you describe in terms of their ideas, from my perspective, is a perfect fit with what Bayat sort of is arguing. The attempt to reconcile faith with religion, with rights, the attempt to reject terms like secularism and liberalism, but to very much deal with the underlying values that are inherent in those concepts. Am I right to detect that you were sort of have some reluctance to classify this group of Saudi thinkers within the broader spectrum of the transformation of Islamist politics that we've seen in other societies and that Bayat characterizes as post-Islamist? I'm wondering why you sort of have that reluctance, or maybe I'm misreading what you wrote in the introduction.
No, you're absolutely right. I have reservation on using post-Islamism in the book, and I think the way I justify it is by saying that Islamism is not, it goes through mutations. I prefer to use the word mutation in order to describe how this trend developed in Saudi Arabia. It's mutation of multiple trends coming from different corners.
That's exactly Asif Bayat's formulation.
But I do not want to say that there is a time when we are going to see the end of Islamism as we knew it, the traditional form of Islamism, and now we're entering a post-Islamist phase. But because there is a cycle, we might revert back to an Islamist phase, and it's not a linear progression from Islamism to post-Islamism. So this is my reservation. Another term that I have tried to avoid is the term liberal Islamist or Islamic liberals. And this has been used in the literature to describe the trend I wrote about. Because I think, to liberalism or the liberal thought has its history as it developed in a particular European context. And I'm reluctant to use this term and take it out of its European context and impose it on people who do not see themselves as liberal. And therefore, in remaining faithful to my anthropological probably training, I wanted to keep away from concepts or terminology that the people themselves don't use.
And how would you respond to the criticism of the people that you profile in the book, that as important as their ideas are in terms of transforming, Saudi political culture and theological understanding, these people are just marginal. They don't represent anyone. It's nice to read about them, but they have no significance for the future of Saudi Arabia. How would you respond to that?
Well, in an absolute monarchy, there is no way to actually have a good assessment of people's opinion about the muted modernist I studied. There are no surveys. We cannot ask people openly whether they support, for example, the Association for Civil and Political Rights in Saudi Arabia. The association is banned in Saudi Arabia, and its founders are serving 10 to 15 years in prison. So you cannot ask people about their opinion. And I think the fact that they were put in prison and received such a long prison sentence attests to the fact that they are important. Maybe they touched a raw nerve in Saudi Arabia between the acquiescent trend of the Wahhabis that insist on total obedience to the ruler and jihadi violence. Those people have a peaceful way of saying that we need reform, we can mobilize people peacefully. And this is why they are dangerous, and this is why the government put them in prison. Just to give you an example, Saudi Arabia prides itself that it designed this program to re-educate and rehabilitate violent jihadis. And this is like the flagship of how Saudi Arabia deals with its own terrorists. It invited international media, the UN praised Saudi Arabia, the US government praised Saudi Arabia that it designed this program to rehabilitate jihadis and sort of almost like create a cultural revolution. And Saudi Arabia publicizes this. Sometimes they go through this program, they come out of prison and they migrate, they escape to Yemen, and they continue to practice the violence. But those muted modernists are not subjected to this kind of rehabilitation program. They are simply put in prison. I think the reason why they are subjected to harsh repression is because their ideas resonate with people. Saudis find in their discourse an attempt to move beyond the absolute monarchy, an attempt to create a political system that remains faithful to its roots, to its Islamic authenticity, but at the same time allows people to participate in government and in policy. It is this middle ground that is dangerous to the government, and this is why a judge like Sulaiman Al-Rasheed, who is like almost 80 now, receives 15 years in prison. So by the time he finishes his prison sentence and also another 15 years of the ban on travel, he will be 110-year-old.
Right. I was struck actually by the similarities in your book between the early phases of Islamic reform in Iran. And one of the things that I think benefited the Islamic reform movement in Iran was that they could rely on senior clerics who had religious authority that the regime could not easily silence on their side, who underwent their own transformation and were leading voices for supporting democracy and human rights. Are there any similar clerical authorities in Saudi Arabia who would be can be characterized within this sort of third modernist trend that you talk about?
Unfortunately, not many Saudi religious scholars supported the trend. In fact, the judges were completely against it because it actually undermines their authority, and they felt threatened by this kind of modernism. Reinterpretation of Islamic texts in ways that open up the public sphere to new modern ideas. There is one religious scholar, Salman al-Ouda, who's very, very important. he could not support them fully and openly. And therefore, he remained quiet for a long time. But when the prison sentence was announced, he started writing and tweeting. And he is very, very careful. He doesn't want to associate himself completely with the trend that I described in the book. Perhaps he fears the recurrent repression. Remember, he was in prison in the 1990s for almost 4 or 5 years. He came out of prison and he started sort of moderating his stance on the government. And perhaps the reason why they haven't been so successful, these modernists, is because they didn't have a strong and important religious cleric supporting them.
Interesting. So we're in a school of foreign policy, school of international studies, and it would be completely irresponsible of me if I didn't take advantage of the opportunity that your presence here gives me to ask you a couple of questions in the end with respect to Saudi Arabia, its foreign policy, and its relationship to the United States. So the big debate, just to crystallize the debate that you're familiar with here in this country with respect to Saudi Arabia, is most people will acknowledge that yes, there are these deeply problematic things that come out of Saudi Arabia in terms of its regional role and international role. But the argument goes that there's no other alternative, that if we push the Saudi regime to reform, to be more accountable to its own citizens, to democratize, we run the risk of destabilizing it and getting something much worse. And thus, the argument is that there's no other alternative except to accept the status quo for better or for worse.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
I've heard this argument, and it's a very, very well-established argument that runs through foreign policy in the US and in Europe as well. However, we have to moderate our expectation when it comes to Saudi Arabia. The fact that this repression that is practiced in Saudi Arabia is actually problematic because it did produce the trend that the whole world is fighting today. Terrorism, that has gone global, originated in Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget that. And continuous repression has led to people taking violent paths. And therefore, to think of the Saudi regime as a shield against terrorism is not factual. It is actually counterproductive. Now, what happens usually in this situation is that the Saudi regime had made it clear that there is no alternative but their rule. And if ever there are elections, if ever there is an opening of the political system, the Islamists are going to come. But we don't know. We don't know. The fact that in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections and then they were deposed in 2013, we assume that in Saudi Arabia, the same thing will happen. Now, Saudi Arabia faces more challenges and also worse challenges than Egypt. If there is a destabilization in the country, there is the threat of fragmentation, and simply because Saudi Arabia does not have any institutions that have permanence or durability that can actually become a buffer zone against complete chaos. And the longer the regime continues in its policy of prohibiting civil society, repressing activists, prohibiting civil action, mobilization, the less likely that we're going to have a modern system that can absorb shock. What we're going to have is continuity in terrorism. Right. We're going to have more repression that is counterproductive.
So, assuming one day we get to a point in this country where we have someone in the White House who actually cares about the world and changing U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia, if you were to to give some advice, prescriptions on what concretely the United States can be doing and should be doing to perhaps gradually nudge Saudi Arabia in a more constructive direction, what are some concrete policy positions?
I personally don't believe that a foreign government like the U.S. could actually trigger a democratic transformation in another country. The U.S. has a very bad record in doing exactly that, especially when it uses military force to trigger any kind of democratic transformation. But what the US government can do is stop its unconditional support for a regime like Saudi Arabia, which is repressive, authoritarian, and does not allow the people to have any say in policy. So how they could do that is to make US support conditional on Saudi Arabia doing certain things, respecting human rights, stopping gender discrimination in the country, and also stopping its regional war. Let's remember that US support for Saudi Arabia allows it to launch wars. Now we're getting into a different phase of Saudi government activism and regional interventions, which we didn't used to have in the same scale. Of course, the Saudi regime had always played games and intervened in the region, whether it was during Abdel Nasser in Egypt, or during in Syria, in Iraq, in Bahrain, and in other countries. But today we are entering a new phase, a military intervention that is assisted by US weapons sold to the Saudi regime. So how Saudi Arabia is always believed to be a moderate stabilizing force in the region, but in fact today we find that it is a destabilizing force. It has its own ambitions and its own rivalries with countries like Iran, and therefore its interventions are dictated by its bid to become the regional hegemon in the whole of the Arab world, which is causing a humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and also it is assisted, whether we like it or not, by this unconditional support that the US had given to the Saudi regime. So the US can actually stop this unconditional support and reconfigure its relationship with an authoritarian regime like the Saudis. Trade and the sale of arms should not take priority. There are other ways of making the Saudi regime respect human rights, and also that would mitigate against these really violent trends emerging in Saudi Arabia and consolidating themselves, such as the terrorism crisis we witness.
American politicians would respond to what you just said, that if we try and make those demands of Saudi Arabia, that translates into a loss of jobs in the United States. Our unemployment numbers will go up because they won't be buying our products anymore. And how do I tell my constituents that you can't have a job anymore because we want to promote democracy or help reform in Saudi Arabia?
I think we've heard this argument. I've heard it in Britain as well among British diplomats. They say that if we don't sell Saudi Arabia arms, then the French would do, or the Chinese. Arms sales should be, it's not like selling any kind of product, especially if they are going to be used to bomb another country. There are international law treaties on how governments could use these arms, especially if they are sold by the US or other Western countries. It is not a carte blanche to use these arms either to oppress your own people or launch wars against other countries in the region. So there are legal treaties that countries like Britain and the US should comply by, that limit the sale of arms if they are going to be used in launching wars against countries such as Yemen, which is the poorest Arab country, and it is devastated. Over the last 2 years, there's like complete devastation of the Yemeni infrastructure, which was meager to begin with. But also the irony of this intervention in Yemen is the US is bombing Yemen in order to eliminate Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia is bombing Sana'a and other parts of Yemen in order to eliminate Al-Houthi. But Al-Qaeda is also considers the Houthis as its enemies. So it's a really ironic situation where the US is bombing Al-Qaeda, and there had been reports that Al-Qaeda is actually working with the Saudis in Yemen. So it's
counterproductive.
Counterproductive sort of mess.
Yeah, you know, I could spend another hour talking to you, Madawi. These are very dark times for all of us, but your scholarship and your insight is illuminating some of that darkness for us. So thank you for joining us on our Denver Dialogue, Middle East Dialogue series.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you and visiting Denver.
Pleasure to have you. Thanks.